I call close Swarbrick.
E te manga, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou te whare. Madam Speaker, there's been a lot made of the fact that as I've stood up here representing the Greens in opposition to this legislation, that I've exerted some level of frustration. And that's true. I am deeply frustrated about the fact that we are sitting under urgency without due process for this legislation through a select committee process, which ironically the national-led government is saying that they think should have occurred to a greater extent when it came to the imposition of this legislation in the first place. But also the fact that I have not heard yet one coherent or consistent argument from members of the government in the need to repeal this legislation. So if I may, Madam Speaker, given that this is the only scrutiny that we'll have on this repeal legislation, I think it is really important to put these points on record again and again. As actually members of the government themselves have stated, this legislation, as it currently sits on our statute books, doesn't fix our broken tax system. So let's dig into what it is that the Greens are talking about when we're talking about our broken tax system. Well, actually, arguably, some would say it's by design that it is inequitable and unfair, as reflected in that report from the beginning of this year from the IRD with subsidiary papers from Treasury, which showed us that the wealthiest 311 families in this country pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average New Zealander. And what that kind of rubbed up against is the general sentiment and sense out there that many New Zealanders have that that tax system is unfair. But that tax system is a result of either intentional decisions that have been made by governments after governments after governments, or by intentional neglect. And that is the point of this reporting legislation, to require that for the first time, God forbid, in this country, we have consistent reporting against consistent measures so that we can measure the efficacy of our tax system against principles. So, Madam Speaker, to dig through those principles, because I think it is a really, really important point that I actually haven't heard any contention from members of the government in opposition to any of the 7 principles within the legislation. So let's talk about those 7 principles. The first is the notion of horizontal equity, and this is a bingo card, so folks can play along at home, or those on the government benches if they'd like to actually address the substance of the legislation that they're repealing under urgency this morning. Horizontal equity, first up. That is basically the notion, and I quote, the extent to which people with similar levels of economic income pay similar amounts of tax. Seems like a pretty fair metric that we should be measuring against. The second principle is efficiency, something that I often hear members of the government railing in support for. Efficiency, and I quote, is the extent to which tax revenue is raised in ways that minimise costs to the economy. Wow, including distortions. The third principle is that of vertical equity, and here I quote, tax is progressive if people with higher levels of economic income pay a higher proportion of income in tax, end quote. Madam Speaker, that is a principle that's been baked into our tax system since time immemorial. The fourth principle is of revenue integrity, and that is, and I quote, coherent and sustainable over time and minimises opportunities for tax avoidance and tax evasion, end quote. And Mr. Speaker, I'll never here forget the point at which we were debating another piece of tax legislation a few years ago when the Honourable Andrew Bailey said there is such a thing as legitimate tax avoidance. And he really said the quiet part out loud there in talking about how our tax system enables those with power and wealth to squirrel away that wealth in such a way to avoid payment of taxation. It's totally legal and totally legitimate. Is it ethical? Is it fair? Well, that's exactly what this principle would have allowed us to report against. The fifth principle is one of compliance and administrative costs. Again, something I would have thought that this government, who was really opposed to waste, would have been in support of. It is, and I quote, the extent to which compliance and administrative costs for taxpayers and the government are reasonable, end quote. The sixth is certainty and predictability. Here I thought that we loved a certain investment environment. That is, and I quote, the extent to which the tax system is transparent and taxpayers are able to determine their tax obligations before they are due. Is that not a really important principle that all of us in this House should abide by or seek to uphold? The seventh is the principle of flexibility and adaptability. Here, I quote, it says, the extent to which the tax system keeps pace with changes in society, in particular technological and commercial developments and changes in inequality or comparative well-being, end quote. Madam Speaker, the reason that I thought it was really, really important to put that on the record is because I've reflected on a number of the speeches, especially from new members, and it appears as though they're not quite aware of the extent of the process that we had undertaken at Finance and Expenditure Committee to put really, really serious scrutiny on these principles and the operation of this legislation. And here I would just refer those members back to the points not made by the government, not even made by IRD advisors or by officials or even by submitters, but by the independent advisors that members of the ACT Party and the National Party agreed to appointing to our Finance and Expenditure Committee on the basis of those principles and his ability to offer us meaningful insight into them. And this is, again, this substantial document of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee's scrutiny on the taxation reporting legislation. And this is Sir Rob McLeod. You can Google him if you're not aware of how extensive his experience is and his reputation in this space. He says, and I quote, he was actually arguing for the removal of the definition of these principles because he thought that they were so well understood. So just to put this on the record again, Mr. Speaker, he says, and I quote, I would omit the descriptors because the meaning of each design principle is sufficiently well understood on their own. So, Madam Speaker, that then takes us to another point, which we've heard rather flippantly from the Minister and from members of the government, that apparently this was really widely opposed. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't really quite bear out in the facts, which again, I would invite members to go and look at the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee report and the departmental report from that Select Committee scrutiny, which shows us that in fact, the majority of submitters were in favour of consistent reporting and data and evidence on the efficacy and operation of our tax system. In fact, even players like the Federated Farmers were in support of the basic principles as outlined in this legislation. They wanted this reporting because you know what, Madam Speaker? All of us benefit. All New Zealanders benefit when we have more access to information, more transparency, so that better and more informed decisions can be made by the government. But also, so that those in contention with the direction of the government can make the argument in the opposite direction. And Madam Speaker, here I just reflect on a statement from Jeanette Fitzsimons, who obviously was the founding female co-leader of the Greens, who said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And we can reflect on a number of different instruments that Parliaments past have instituted in order to provide greater levels of insight into decision-making, into data, into evidence, such that the public can draw their own conclusion. I think about how our forebears advocated, for example, for the pecuniary interests for members of Parliament, which at the time might have been argued against on the basis that they're a massive incursion into the privacy of members of Parliament. And, members of the public should just trust members of Parliament when it comes to any kind of influence that they may or may not have over their decision-making. But hey, guess what? It's now a matter of common practice, and it is out there for members of the public to draw their own conclusions. It is standard practice of transparency and accountability. Same actually goes for PAYE. When that was first instituted as an income tax proposal, there were arguments made that this was a massive incursion on the privacy of individuals to organise and arrange their own affairs and, just a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge, just trust us. But obviously now, again, Madam Speaker, this is a matter of common practice because this is how society and our economy evolves. So let's talk about that point of how our society and our economy has evolved. Well, it's evolved in such a way that, as I held up before in the first reading, we have the greatest levels of wealth inequality in this country that we have ever seen on record. And you know what? It's actually, as far as democracy goes, an okay thing that members of the government don't want to see that addressed. That is their prerogative. They can choose what side they want to sit on when it comes to that argument and that debate. But our contention here in the opposition is that in lieu of having access to that data and that information and that consistent data set, we are robbing not only this Parliament of the opportunity to have a meaningful and informed debate and discussion, but of the general public's ability to also participate in understanding precisely what is going on. Madam Speaker, the point's been made time and again that this work has actually already been done, because we know that the first report is due out on the 31st of December, and the 2.5 FTEs who have been seconded into working on this, just for the record again, that's 0.06% of all of the FTEs working within IRD, we have seen that they will have already done this work. So very much looking forward to putting forth those OAAs to the Minister and seeing the advice that he so evidently has seen, which scared him so much into putting this into urgency before Christmas. The final point, Madam Speaker, is that I just really put it on the government, who has said that they still want to see some transparency in reporting, to tell us precisely what format they'd like it to take, because the IRD themselves in their own regulatory impact statements asking for more resources to keep doing exactly that.
I call the Honourable David Seymour.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member who's just resumed a seat for the speech she gave, although I have to say I don't think the last 9 minutes were really necessary. Mr Speaker, I stand in support of the Taxation Principles Reporting Act repeal bill, and let me take an opportunity to respond to some of the things that we've just heard. We've heard time and again that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay half the tax rate of the average New Zealander. We've heard that time and again, repeated by people on the opposition benches. And I wouldn't describe it as lying, because as Chloe Swarbrick recently found, you're not supposed to say that. In fact, for people who want to watch on replay, you can see the high and mighty Chloe Swarbrick, who tells us we're all inexperienced and have no data, come into the House at midnight and apologise to the House for not knowing the most basic rules. But, Mr Speaker, she also repeats continuously this untrue assertion that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay half the tax rate of the average New Zealander. And let me tell you where that comes from. It comes from a fishing expedition that the previous government sent the IRD on to survey 311 high net worth New Zealanders. And they calculated how much money those people had and how much their paper assets increased over a period of time and how much tax they paid. And they divided the tax they paid by how much their paper wealth had increased to try and calculate what they described as an effective tax rate. Well, the problem with that is, Madam Speaker, that if that was really the standard that was applied to New Zealanders, then take a year like 2021. The median house price in 2021 under the previous government, when it lost control of monetary policy, lost control of inflation, the median house price increased by $135,000. And that means that the average person had a $45,000 tax bill. You know, that's what they would have paid if we took this thinking seriously. If we were seriously going to say that every time your paper assets go up, such as house prices increase, that you are liable to pay tax on that, then we would have a very different tax system. And actually, that is the policy of the Greens. The question is whether it is the policy of the Labor Party. Does the Labor Party want to join the Greens in saying that people should pay tax on their paper asset gains? Should there be a tax on your house? And I see Grant Robertson waving the bill at me while I'm responding to members who have contributed to the debate. And if Grant Robertson doesn't like the members contributing to the debate, he better think about how to win back Wellington Central from them. That's the real problem he's got. So, Madam Speaker, that is the real question about tax principles. That's the real question about tax principles, Madam Speaker. Are we serious about taxing wealth? Because the Green Party is very clear that they're coming after your house. And I remember debating Julianne Genter in Epsom one day years ago, and the question was asked, how should a person who has a lot of assets, perhaps a widow who has recently lost their partner, how should they pay for the Greens' wealth tax on their house? And Julianne Genter told the audience, oh, well, maybe they could get a reverse mortgage. And you could hear the air getting sucked out of the room. She hasn't said it again, I've got to say. But, Madam Speaker, that is where these tax principles take us. The problem that the Green Party has, and the Labor Party for that matter, is that none of their own policies would actually adhere to these principles, because these parties want to start using tax not as a way to raise revenue, not in a way to be fair, not in a way to be efficient. They want to add new taxes. They want to add new taxes that will go after your assets, and if you don't have the money to pay, they'll put you on a reverse mortgage and start bleeding you dry. That's what these guys really believe. And, Madam Speaker, that's why this Tax Principles Reporting Act that we're repealing today makes no difference, because the parties opposite who brought this bill in then went and wrote tax policies and campaigned on policies that would never be consistent with the Tax Principles Reporting Act. And I see a new member over there from the Greens who's frowning at me, thinking, does this make sense? Was that really our policy? Well, let me explain to her how it works. Actually, the Green Party's policy is that you pay 1.5% wealth tax on assets and trust. So you've got two people, one owns a home that they'll put in trust. And if you've put your home in a trust because you're worried that your kid is getting married and you don't want them to lose their asset in a settlement when it's their inheritance from you, you pay 1.5%. The person that keeps the house in their own ownership doesn't pay the 1.5%. So that's one Green Party policy that would fail the horizontal equity test. So they voted for the bill and then they campaigned on a policy that would fail the first test. And here's another one. They say if you have $4 million of wealth, you pay 2.5% as a couple, but you pay only 2.5% on $2 million of wealth if you're single. So what happens to an older couple who might have $3 million of wealth that they worked their whole life for? They've got a nice house, they've got some retirement savings. Their $3 million is not taxable because it's under $4 million. All of a sudden, one partner dies. That can happen with elderly couples. And all of a sudden, one of those people is liable for 2.5% on the extra $1 million, $25,000 a year tax bill for that elderly lady who's grieving the loss of her husband under the Greens tax policy. Now, is that equitable? Is that equitable? Oh, here we go.
We got a point of order.
Speaker, I just wanted to raise with you a question, because it seems to me that the member currently speaking is not speaking to the bill at all, but is talking about imagined conversations from 10 years ago, policies from other parties that they campaigned on. I mean, very interesting, and I'm glad that he's promoting our policies, but it's not really in the bill.
Thank you for the point of order.
Speaking to the point of order, Madam Speaker.
Can I just, first of all, I'm actually hearing the member who has been on his feet talking about tax principles, and the bill is about tax principles reporting. So unless the member has something further to add to the point of order, I'd ask you to carry on.
Oh, I do, Madam Speaker. In raising the point of order, Julianne Genter said that the conversation, I assume that she was referring to events where she told a group of my Epsom constituents to get a reverse mortgage. She said that was an imagined conversation. I just want to put on the record that actually happened, and for her not to take me at my word and accuse me of lying.
Thank you. That's not a point of order, and sorry, I was I missed that comment when I was speaking to the clerk. So.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I think people watching at home can take heed from the fact that the Green Party is the only party I know that has just tried to shut down a discussion about its own tax policy. But it's kind of understandable. It's kind of understandable. And the point, if Julianne Genter wasn't following along, is that the Green Party voted for this Tax Principles Act and then ran the election on policies, and had they been successful, would have no doubt tried to implement policies that violate the Act. And that, Madam Speaker, is why we oppose it, because even the people who believe in it don't follow it. Why would it make any difference for this Parliament to require the IRD to go to great expense to prepare a report every year when even the people whose idea it was don't agree with it and don't follow it? If it can't have any influence on the Green Party, who think it's desperately necessary to have this law, then how can it possibly have an effect on anyone else? They don't do it. Why would anyone else? Madam Speaker, there's another point that maybe needs to be considered. The Labor and Green parties were in government for 6 years, and not a single report was produced under the Tax Principles Reporting Act. Because as we heard earlier, the first report is due at the end of this year. So, Madam Speaker, how is it possible that the Labor Party and the Green Party are sitting here desperately telling us that we have to have this legislation when they themselves governed without it for 6 years? They cannot be sincere when they believe that this is important. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we are interested in saving the taxpayer money. We are interested in a smaller, more efficient government. We are interested in removing red tape, regulation and bureaucracy wherever we find it. And taking a few hours to debate the removal of the Taxation Principles Reporting Act is a very good example of this government getting to work and saving money so that people sitting at home can actually have some more money left at the end of the week and spend less of their time funding pointless bureaucracy and stupid laws that even the people who came up with it and supported it do not believe in, because even they don't follow it in their own policy. As an added Christmas bonus, the Green Party are over there and they're not going to be taxing a house. Thank you, Madam Speaker.